And hello there, and welcome to the INRIS Files. Thoughts on culture and the human condition from a Generation X point of view. Uh, Thank you for tuning in. And I've been at a little bit of a loss as to what to talk during today's live stream. And I've been thinking quite a bit about it. One of the things that occurs to me right now is there seems to be a shortage of trust among people, and that includes trust of the media. And I am a former member of the press corps. I was a writer for a weekly news magazine, and I wrote news features as well as fiction and poetry and all the sort of stuff you would expect to see in a news feature magazine. Yes, even poetry. That's a story. Anyway, but I covered some stories very in depth. And then later on, when I worked at a news department at a radio station, I not only read the news where we would have fact sheets that would talk about the different aspects of the story. We would read through those, pull out the salient points, write our 3 or 4 sentences per story, and then read them over the air. So I think calling that news reader is an appropriate description of that particular job. But also, as part of that job, so during a radio shift, you might have 1 broadcast, or you might have 4 broadcasts. You might have several more than that. If you're on the morning shift, that's 4 hours, 2 times that you're on the air per hour, top and the bottom of the hour. And you would have to write up your copy. And in the case of the morning shift, you had to write up 4 different versions of each story so that it sounded like you were presenting new information each time, even though there wasn't any new information to be had. It's just you had a fact sheet with like 10 facts on it, and you would emphasize a different few facts each time you read the news over the air. And since you had 4 different versions of each story, very rarely were people listening to the radio for more than 2 hours in the morning, which is how long they would have to listen before they noticed that you were actually repeating a story word for word from what you had read earlier. So one of the other aspects of your job, though, when you were working as a news reporter for a radio station, is you would actually also go out and cover events. And when I say cover events, usually it is something that is very boring and banal, like the city council meetings that happen on every Tuesday night at 7:00 at the city hall chambers, or the county council meetings. In the case of the county where I was, Tompkins County, New York, um, the county government was called the Board of Representatives. And so if you were covering the Board of Reps, they would have their meetings, you would attend. It was a larger body. And what would happen is they talk about whatever it is they talk about, and then you talk to them afterwards to ask them questions about whatever item they had just debated. You would decide which of the items that had been discussed were newsworthy. You would type up fact sheets on the basis of what you heard during the meeting. And from any given county Board of Reps meeting or city council meeting, if you were lucky, you might get 3 stories. More often than not, you'd get 1 or 2. You had to at least get 1. I mean, there had to at least be one thing they discussed that was newsworthy. And the other thing about writing news to be consumed by listeners is it had to be somehow relevant to the listeners. It's not enough for the city council to be debating over whether or not they should go with a cream colored or a white colored or a beige colored newsletter or letterhead. That didn't matter to anybody. but inevitably there would be something that would involve people's taxes or how they put their garbage out. That was a big story in Tompkins County when they decided to go to a recycling program. Uh, or when the county decided that they had to find a new location for the new dump. And then you learn the difference between garbage and trash. It it's a fascinating opportunity to cover these sorts of things that are really, they seem so mundane, but later on you realize this actually does affect people's lives. And as you put together your fact sheets, you try to highlight this is how it's going to affect you. It's going to affect you if you live in this neighborhood, that they're considering it as one of the sites for a future landfill, that kind of thing. Every once in a while, you would find out that there was some news that was more of a crime related nature. Now, when you were on the morning shift for news radio, one of the first things you do is call the police department, and they have somebody whose job it is to talk to the public. So you would call and you would say, "Hello, I'm calling from WVBR. Do you have anything to report?" And inevitably, they would say no. They might occasionally say, "Well, because weather has downed trees in this particular area, we're routing traffic around that area. Not a good place to go," kind of thing. They almost never had any information for us, even when there was actually news going on. It is something that has led me over time to to have some strong negative associations with that particular police department, because they would absolutely lie to you and say that there's nothing of particular interest going around, even when there was an active murder investigation in a city that very rarely had experienced any murders. So, on one particular occasion, I happened to be walking up one of the steep streets. It was doesn't matter what the name of the street was. Anyway, I'm walking up this street, State Street it was, and there's a lot of commotion outside this one house. And I call up the radio station and I say, "Are you aware that there's something going on State Street?" And they said, "No, we just called the police department. They said there's nothing to report." And I'm like, "Yeah, there's something going on here." And this is a small town. It didn't take very long for other news departments to recognize that there was something going on. So eventually, there were about 3 of us reporters. We were behind the police lines, and the police didn't really wanna talk to us too much about what was going on, but we saw what was going on. There was clearly some sort of an investigation taking place, and we were able to determine before leaving, it was a murder investigation. A body had been found. This body had been found, by the way, if you are in any way, uh, not inclined to listen to crime stories, this is only gonna take about 30 seconds for me to describe the crime, and then we're gonna skip right over it. But it was very clearly a homicide, and it was very clear that whoever committed the homicide wanted to be very, very certain that the victim remained deceased. The victim had, and here are the graphic details. The victim had been bludgeoned. The victim had been tied to a chair, stabbed multiple times, shot. Was the victim shot? If the victim wasn't shot, close enough. Absolutely stabbed several times and bludgeoned, and then set on fire. The victim was very, very, very deceased. So if you didn't want to hear any of the gory details are over. We will proceed with the story. So we had a victim. It took us a while to get the police department to even tell us the name of the victim. You understand, they had to first they had to identify the victim, and then they had to find next of kin, and all the rest of that totally makes sense. And then there had to be an investigation. The thing about police activity is that at some point it does become political. And in this particular case, it became political as soon as the district attorney was involved. The city attorney, the district attorney for the city was an incumbent who had run several times and won several times in the past. And he was up for reelection this particular year. However, he was skating on very thin ice as far as his career goes. He had been pulled over a couple of times for DWI. And even though he was district attorney, and therefore the police who would pull him over would inevitably allow him on his merry way, word got out that this was a thing that was happening. And word got out that if you caught him on just the right day, you would discover just how inebriated he could become. So his reputation was flagging. And when a murder like this, that was so spectacular, ends up on the scene, he has to get a conviction. He has to hope that the police will find somebody. And then he has to work with the police to build up a solid enough case to get a conviction, because otherwise he is not keeping the streets safe from violent crime. And since his job is already on the line, he is almost certainly going to end up being replaced by whoever runs against him to be the DA. So the police did their investigation. They eventually have a suspect in custody. This is when the police start cooperating with the press, and we would call and say, do you have anything to report? Yes, we have made an arrest in the case of the murder of this person, and we will not be releasing details yet on the person who was arrested, but we will have that information soon. First, we have to go through the arraignment process, blah, 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 blah. So at least now we were starting to get information. And as fate would have it, eventually this person was indicted, and then there was a murder trial. This is fascinating stuff for the city of Ithaca, New York, because murder trials don't happen very often in Ithaca, New York. And the news departments for all of the local radio stations, all of the local, and when I say local, I mean anything within the area. Ithaca itself, I think, was home to 3 radio stations at the time, maybe 4. But then you also had the surrounding area. When it came to television, you had the Ithaca community cable television, but then you also had local news stations from network affiliates in surrounding towns like Binghamton, Syracuse, Rochester, that kind of thing. So a lot of people were showing up for this trial to see what was going on. And for my radio station, some of us would be essentially on a rotation basis. We would be covering the trial, because it wasn't possible for us to spend all of our time at the trial when we also had other things to do. So we divvied up the work. I did not attend every day of the trial. Our news director attended many of them. I'd say she attended more of them than anybody else in the department. But I did attend a few. And one of the things that became very evident very quickly during this murder trial was that A, this man was guilty, and B, not of this crime. I have never before, or actually since, been in the presence of somebody who just emanated waves of malice. This was an individual who I was glad was restrained and was not going to be sitting near the press box, because when he just walked by, there was something in the way he carried himself, something in the way he acted. There's a movie called No Country for Old Men where you have a villain in this movie who he's a force of nature. He could just as easily kill you as buy a pack of gum from you. And this guy felt like that. It was, words can barely describe how somebody as cynical and worldly as myself could actually feel like I was in the presence of somebody who did not care if anybody around him lived or died. It's a very unsettling experience. So, uh, listen to the testimony that's being presented. Listen to the witnesses who were talking about their expertise or what they found or what they saw. And it actually was a very interestingly built case, or argument that this man was guilty of this particular crime. And it was also one of those things where you watch the cross-examination and everything else, and you come to the realization this is not the evidence that this person committed this particular crime. You definitely came away with the understanding that this was a guy who was connected to bad people, that he happened to be present when a lot of other bad people came to a bad end. But for all of that, the evidence did not support the idea, at least as I perceived it. It just didn't support the idea that he was actually guilty of this particular crime. And as the prosecution continued and as the case continued to unfold, I think it became increasingly evident to everybody who was there that the prosecution was more interested in getting a conviction than they were interested in finding the actual killer, of the individual who had been murdered. Eventually, the accused was acquitted. He was found not guilty of this murder, and he was released. And as you would expect, the district attorney did not manage to find re-election when his term was up, and when we voted for ultimately his replacement. I bring it up because, well, first of all, I just found that to be a fascinating story. As a general rule, covering the news is kind of boring. Most of it is spent going to meetings. When they were trying to find a new landfill for the county, uh, maybe if we happen to be the ones who were covering it on that particular day, we might go with them to the site where they were investigating whether this site would be a good site for a landfill and all the rest of that. We would get education on what makes for a good landfill site and how they prepare it and all of the rest of that. You do learn a lot, but it's meetings. It's mostly meetings. There is such a thing as investigative journalism. Investigative journalism does happen. And in fact, when I had been writing for that news magazine, I did have to do actual, what you would call boots on the ground research. I had to go out, make calls, find out who the right people were to talk to about the right things, ask the right questions in order to find out why did things play out the way they did. But at the end of the day, most reporting really is just about observing what happened, trying to figure out how, if at all, this will impact your readership or your listenership or your viewership. write down the facts as best you can, and then move along. The reporter is the person who assembles these facts into some sort of a coherent story and then presents them to the audience. And as such, the reporter is one step removed from having from where the decisions were taking place. If I was covering the murder trial, for example, I would write up the fact sheet, but then it was up to the reporter who would actually, or the newsreader, to take my facts, turn them into a story that was no more than 3 or 4 sentences long. Do this if you ever watch television news. And I mean news. I'm not talking about opinion shouting heads shows. I mean, when somebody's actually giving news, typically a story only gets 1 or 2 minutes tops. That's about 3 or 4 sentences. And that's all you get before you move on to the next story. Very rarely do you go further into depth than that. So, when you follow the chain about how all of this is put together in order to get a news broadcast or to get a news magazine, the a lot of hands have touched the story, and those hands, as a general rule, just want to get information to you that is relevant to you. There's been growing distrust of the news media, and I think part of that is because the ownership of outlets for news have gotten very cynical. It's easier for them to get eyeballs if the news is made more sensational. So rather than covering the fact that the electric and gas company is filing a petition to raise the rates, your lead story is, if the gas and electric company have their way, you'll be spending more on your monthly electric bill, or whatever the case may be. It gets more and more outrageous as you get up to bigger and bigger markets, the lengths they will go to in order to excite your passions. There was an expression that was very common in the news media: if it bleeds, it leads. Essentially, whatever can get your attention. And over time, I think ownership of news outlets have gotten cynical enough to where they're kind of demanding blood. They're demanding the stories that are the most divisive. Even so, at the end of the day, most of your reporters want to report the facts. They may have an opinion. They may have an interpretation of what the facts mean. And I have also seen this play out as well. When you only have enough time for 3 or 4 sentences, you may have a newsreader who picks the facts that emphasize their particular point of view. This has always happened. It absolutely does happen. Nonetheless, the facts are still the facts. Most news people, most reporters, most news readers do have the best of intentions. Where you run into problems is the dissection that happens later by the opinion sellers, the shouting heads. When you're talking about a television program, cable news is very little news and a whole lot of analysis. And the analysis is where things can go off the rails. So first of all, I mention this because I've known so many people to say such disparaging things about reporters when reporters really just want to get the facts and pass them along. Reporters are people you know. Reporters are just people, just like cops are just people. They are prone to making mistakes, but they are nonetheless, in general, trying to do their job. The same is true of teachers. The same is true of politicians, believe it or not. The same is true of doctors and lawyers, people who just genuinely want to do their job and then go home, have a nice meal, spend time with the people they care about, and get a good night's sleep. We spend too much time, I think, ascribing ulterior motives to individuals when they just want to do their job. Where you start to run into problems is when people are paid to provide opinion, analysis, and the goal is to get you riled up. This is where you need to be on your guard. And I guess I started with the story of covering a murder trial because it was one of those rare cases where what I was covering was not just a series of meetings, it was a murder trial, and it was salacious. And even then, you report the facts. The facts emerge out of a day's testimony. You write down your list of facts. Your newsreader is going to pick and choose which facts make the most sense in order to tell a coherent story. They present a coherent story and then they move on. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this is sort of related to the live stream I did a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about perception and how we can be primed to see something in the news as meaning one thing or the other just because of our frame of reference and the people we listen to who either prime us to see something a certain way or we prime ourselves to see something a certain way. I think if you want a better understanding of reality, focus on the facts and listen to the analysis and double check it against your own understanding of logic, your own understanding of how things work, without getting excited about generalizations or other biases you may happen to have. I think it's important because our modern American society, and I think this is even happening globally, we're getting more and more divisive. But at the end of the day, your neighbor is just your neighbor, and all the good and the bad that entails. And the more that we get along with our neighbors, the more we're able to make things better for each other. So consider this my plea to keep that in mind. Reporters are just reporters. Do your best to stick with the facts, and maybe you won't be led down the proverbial primrose path by somebody who has potentially ulterior motives. It's my thought for the day. And if you have any agreement, disagreement, or things that you would like to explore about the issues that I'm raising here, please put them in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Take care.